The crowd had gathered before Fannie Ellsworth even knew what was happening. She stepped out of the dry goods store on a Tuesday morning in early April of 1883, a brown paper parcel tucked under one arm and the pale New Mexico sun warming the back of her neck, and she walked directly into a wall of silence so thick it nearly knocked her backward. 40, maybe 50 people lined the main street of Harlan's Crossing, and every single one of them was staring at her with that particular brand of contempt that small towns manufacture so efficiently, that look that said they had already decided everything about her and found her wanting. Fannie stopped walking. The parcel slipped slightly from her grip and she caught it with both hands, pressing it against her chest like a shield. "There she is," someone said, and the voice carried no shame about being heard. She recognized the man who had spoken. Orville Pratt, who ran the feed store and sat on the town council and had never once, in the 14 months Fannie had lived in Harlan's Crossing, given her anything warmer than a suspicious nod. He was standing in the center of the street with his thumbs hooked in his suspenders, and beside him stood a half-dozen men whose expressions mirrored his own. "Miss Ellsworth." He said her name like it tasted wrong in his mouth. "You want to tell us what you know about the Dawson fire?" Fannie felt the blood drain from her face so fast she thought her knees might simply stop working. The Dawson fire. 3 nights ago, the Dawson family's barn had burned to the ground. Nobody had been hurt, thank God, but the barn and 2 horses and a season's worth of stored hay were gone, and the word arson had been circling through town ever since like a vulture that had spotted something already dying. "I don't know anything about the Dawson fire," she said, and her voice, to her enormous relief, came out steady. "That isn't what we heard," Orville Pratt said. "Then what you heard is wrong," she said. The crowd shifted and murmured, and then a woman near the back shouted something about strangers with dark pasts, and another voice said something about her coming from nowhere and how that wasn't natural. And then the sound of it all became a kind of roar, and Fannie stood in the middle of it, feeling the way she imagined a person felt just before they drowned, aware of the pressure but not yet gone. And then a door opened. The sheriff's office was directly across the street, and the man who walked out of it moved with the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had decided exactly what he was going to do before he did it. Sheriff Abel Keating was 31 years old, lean and broad-shouldered, with dark hair worn slightly longer than most lawmen kept theirs, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved by someone with strong opinions about what a jaw ought to be. He wore his star on the left breast of a gray shirt, and his boots hit the boardwalk planks with a sound like punctuation. He stepped down into the street and walked to Fannie's side. Not behind her, not in front of her, beside her. "Orville," he said. Pratt's chin went up. "Sheriff, I heard what you said to this woman." Abel Keating's voice was low and even and somehow more dangerous for it. "And I'm going to say this once plainly so there isn't any confusion afterward. The rumor that Fannie Ellsworth had anything to do with the Dawson fire is wrong. I have investigated this matter personally and I know who is responsible, and it is not her. If I hear this accusation repeated, I will consider it slander and I will treat it accordingly." He paused. "We clear." The crowd was very quiet. Orville Pratt opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Sheriff, now there are things people have seen." "What people have seen," Abel said, "is none of my concern unless it's true. What I know is true is that on the night of the Dawson fire, Miss Ellsworth was not within 2 miles of that property." Another pause, long and deliberate as a held breath. "I know this because I was with her." The silence that followed that statement was the loudest thing Fannie had ever heard. She turned to look at him. He did not look back at her, not yet. His eyes were still on Pratt, steady and unyielding, and in that moment, watching the sheriff of Harlan's Crossing stand in the middle of a street full of hostile people and plant himself between her and all of it, Fannie Ellsworth felt something shift inside her chest that she did not have a name for yet, something that terrified her almost as much as the crowd had. Pratt finally looked away. And then, one by one, the crowd did too. It had been building for a long time. The tension between Fannie and this town, And it had started, as most things did, with something far simpler and far older than arson. It had started with who she was and where she had come from, and what that meant to people who had lived in the same 40 square miles their entire lives, and believed that made them authorities on everything within it. Fannie had arrived in Harlan's Crossing 14 months earlier, in February of 1882, on a stagecoach from Santa Fe. She was 25 years old at the time. With dark auburn hair she kept pinned tightly under a sensible hat and gray-green eyes that people sometimes found unsettling because they were too direct for a woman, according to the particular wisdom of 1882 New Mexico. She had no husband, no family in the territory, and a modest amount of money that she had earned herself teaching school in Santa Fe, which she had been doing since the age of 19 after working her way west from Missouri following the death of her parents. She came to Harlan's Crossing because a woman named Margaret Holt had written her a letter. Margaret ran the town's small schoolhouse and had broken her right wrist in a wagon accident and needed someone to take her classes through the spring term. The letter had found Fannie at exactly the right moment, when Santa Fe had begun to feel like a too small coat, and she had packed her single large trunk and her teaching supplies and arrived on a cold February morning to find the town exactly as she had expected. Suspicious, beautiful, hard, and already forming an opinion of her. She had stayed with Margaret Holt through the spring and then through the summer and then, when Margaret's wrist healed but her health generally declined, through the fall and into the winter, and then into the following year, taking on more of the teaching and more of the management of the small house they shared on the east edge of town. She liked the children. She liked the wide, flat light over the desert, and the way the mountains looked in the morning and the particular silence of the high desert at night. She stayed. What she had not accounted for, what she had perhaps foolishly underestimated, was how a town regarded a woman who lived alone, who had no man to anchor her to a respectable identity, who taught school and managed her own money and occasionally expressed opinions in public that were not specifically invited. In 1882 and 1883, in a territory that had only been somewhat civilized for a decade, a woman like Fannie Ellsworth was, to many people, a problem to be solved or an explanation to be demanded. She had met Abel Keating in her second week in Harlan's Crossing, when he had come to the schoolhouse to speak to Margaret about some administrative matter involving the school's land deed, and Margaret had introduced them in the small front room. He had taken his hat off when he came inside, which she noted, and he had spoken to her directly rather than over her shoulder at Margaret, which she also noted. He had not smiled in the automatic, placating way that some men did when confronted with a woman who looked at them without deference. He had simply looked back, level and considering, and said, "Miss Ellsworth, welcome to Harlan's Crossing. I hope you'll find it agreeable." She had said she hoped so too. That first impression had been accurate in most ways. Abel Keating was a man who said what he meant and who listened when people spoke to him, which made him unusual in any context and particularly unusual in a town that ran on gossip and assumption. He had been sheriff of Harlan's Crossing for 4 years, having been appointed at 27 by the county board following the retirement of the previous sheriff, and he had spent those 4 years building a reputation for being scrupulously fair and very difficult to intimidate. He was also, Fannie had come to understand over the course of 14 months of careful observation, deeply private in a way that had nothing to do with coldness. He had a sister in Colorado he wrote to once a week. He read whatever books he could get through the mail-order catalog. He cooked his own meals because he found the hotel dining room too loud. He had grown up in Texas, had come to New Mexico at 23 with a group of ranchers who had eventually moved on, and had stayed because he found the country suited him. He had never been married, and the town had stopped speculating about why, or at least had stopped speculating loudly, because he had made it sufficiently clear on several occasions that he considered his private life genuinely private. In the 14 months before the morning of Orville Pratt's accusation, Fannie and Abel had developed what she might have described as a careful friendship, if she had been pressed to describe it at all. He stopped by the schoolhouse occasionally with questions about the children's attendance records, which the sheriff's office kept as part of the town's administrative functions. She sometimes walked past his office on her way to the post office, and if the door was open, they would exchange a few words about the news in the territorial papers, or about something one of the children had said or done. Once, he had fixed a broken hinge on the schoolhouse door without being asked, leaving the repair complete and a brief note that said simply, "Hinge was giving trouble. Keating," which she had, perhaps irrationally, kept in her desk drawer. Twice, on Sundays, they had walked in the same direction after the church service that Fannie attended, and that Abel sometimes attended when duty allowed, and both times the walk had stretched from 5 minutes to nearly an hour without either of them appearing to notice or intend it. They had talked about books and about the quality of the territorial governor's recent decisions, and about a student of Fannie's named Thomas who had a remarkable aptitude for mathematics and whose father wanted him to work cattle instead. Abel had said that mathematics would serve a person better than cattle work in the long run, but that the father had the right to make the choice, and the child would make his own choices later. Fannie had said she thought the child deserved someone to tell him his gift was real while he was still young enough for it to matter. Abel had looked at her for a moment, and then said he agreed with that. What Fannie had not told Abel, had not told anyone in Harlan's Crossing, was the thing that made the rumor about arson feel specifically like a trap rather than merely a slander. She had a history with fire, or rather with the accusation of it, and the hidden motive behind Orville Pratt's specific choice of accusation was not, she was terrified, an accident. In Missouri, when she was 17 years old, a fire had destroyed the house of a neighboring family named Calder. She had been in the area when it happened, walking home from a friend's house after dark, and she had in fact helped raise the alarm and had stood at the well pulling bucket after bucket of water, alongside the rest of the community for 3 hours while the Calder house burned. But there had been a man in that town who had wanted something from her father, a business arrangement her father had refused, and that man had told people that he had seen young Fannie Ellsworth near the Calder house with a lantern before the fire started. The accusation had never been formally charged, but it had followed her like a smell, the reason she had eventually left Missouri, the dark past that she had hoped distance would render irrelevant. Someone in Harlan's Crossing knew about Missouri. That was the only explanation for the specificity of Orville Pratt's accusation. And the fact that someone knew, the fact that someone had constructed this particular trap for her, meant there was a hidden motive she did not yet understand, and a danger she did not yet fully see. After the crowd dispersed on that Tuesday morning in April, Abel Keating did not immediately leave her side. He waited until the street was nearly empty and then turned to look at her for the first time, and the directness of his attention was somehow more startling than all the hostility that had preceded it. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. He nodded as if honesty was what he had expected. "Can you come to my office?" She had never been inside the sheriff's office before. It was a small room, efficiently organized, with a gun rack along one wall and a large desk covered in papers and a potbelly stove that was doing its best against the April chill. There was a back room with 2 cells and a door that led to a linta where he kept a horse. He offered her the chair across from his desk and sat behind it himself, and for a moment they simply looked at each other, which was something they had done carefully for 14 months and were now apparently doing differently. "Was any of what you said true?" she asked. "About knowing where I was that night?" "All of it," he said. She waited. "I was doing a late patrol," he said. "Around 11 o'clock. I saw a light in the schoolhouse and I could see you through the window. You were grading papers. You were there until past midnight because the light was still on when I came back past on my way to the livery." He said it matter-of-factly, without apology for the observation. "The Dawson barn fire started at around 11:30. You were half a mile away with a lamp and a stack of papers." "Why didn't you say so before now?" she asked. "The accusation has been circulating for 3 days." Something moved across his face. It was not quite guilt, not quite something else. "I was trying to resolve the matter through investigation rather than through public confrontation," he said. "I made an error in judgment. I should have stopped it sooner." It was, she thought, a very honest answer. She filed it away alongside the note about the hinge, alongside the hour-long Sunday walks, alongside the way he had stood beside her in the street rather than behind or in front. "Abel," she said, and then stopped, because she had not intended to use his first name. They had always been formal with each other, and the word had come out before she reviewed it. He did not react to the informality except that something in his eyes shifted slightly, the way still water shifts when something breaks the surface. "Fannie," he said, and it was equally deliberate. "Someone knows about Missouri," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Tell me about Missouri," she told him. All of it. The Calder fire and the man with the grudge against her father and the rumor that had been started with the specific intention of destroying her family's standing in the community. She told him how her father had died before the matter was resolved, and how her mother had died the following winter, and how she had been 17 and alone, and the only way forward she could see was to simply leave the place where people had already decided who she was and go somewhere else and try to be a person they hadn't decided anything about yet. When she finished, Abel said nothing for a long moment. He was looking at the surface of his desk, but she had the sense that he wasn't seeing it. "The man who started the rumor in Missouri," he said. "Do you know where he is now?" She felt cold. "His name was Declan Morrow. I don't know where he is." "I've spent years not knowing and being grateful for not knowing." Abel looked up. "Do you know a man named Caleb Rourke?" The name landed in her chest like a stone in water. "No," she said, and then, because that was not entirely true, "I know the name. He was associated with Declan Morrow in Missouri, a business partner of some kind, but I never met him." "He arrived in Harlan's Crossing about 3 weeks ago," Abel said. "He's staying at the Overland Hotel. He told people he was a cattle buyer. His voice was careful and even. He is not a cattle buyer." The shape of the trap became suddenly, terrifyingly clear to her. "He came here specifically." "It looks that way." "Why?" she asked. "What could Morrow or Rourke possibly want from me now? My father is dead. There is nothing to gain." Abel's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Your father left property in Missouri. I made some inquiries over the past 3 days. The land was held in trust and the trust is contested. If you were convicted of arson or even sufficiently disgraced, you would lose any claim to it. The land passed to another party." She stared at him. "I didn't know there was any property." "Your father's lawyer apparently tried to contact you and couldn't locate you. The claim has been in limbo for several years. A man named Declan Morrow has been attempting to establish a competing claim." Abel met her eyes steadily. "If you are publicly discredited, particularly through a pattern of accusation that follows you across state lines, the case becomes much easier to dismiss." The forbidden knowledge of it, the realization that someone had been hunting her across years and miles, made her feel momentarily dizzy. She pressed both hands flat on the desk in front of her to steady herself, and then became aware that she had placed them on his desk rather than her own lap, which was not a thing she would normally have done. And she looked up to find Abel watching her hands with an expression that was not professional concern, but something older and more personal. She did not move her hands. "What happens now?" she said. He looked up from her hands to her face. "Now I deal with Caleb Rourke," he said, "and I would like your permission to write to the lawyer in Missouri and establish your location and identity legally. If we can get your claim on record, Morrow's case weakens considerably." "You've already looked into this," she said. "You've been investigating for 3 days, not just the fire. You've been looking into all of it." "Yes," he said simply. She wanted to ask him why, but she suspected she already knew, and the knowledge of it was so warm and so frightening that she chose to let it sit without examination for the moment, the way you let a fire settle before you try to bank it. "Do what you need to do," she said. He nodded. And then, after a moment of hesitation that she found unexpectedly moving in a man who was otherwise so certain of himself, "Fannie, I need you to be careful. Rourke is staying in town, but I don't fully understand what he is or is not capable of. Until I do, I would prefer you not go anywhere after dark alone." She looked at him. "You are asking me to limit my movements." "I am asking you," he said carefully, "not to make yourself a target while I work to remove the reason for you being one. That is different from limiting your movements." It was, she decided, a fair distinction. "All right," she said. She left the office with the brown paper parcel still tucked under her arm, having entirely forgotten what was in it. On the street, the April sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge, and the town looked ordinary and almost peaceful in the morning light. She stood on the boardwalk for a moment and breathed slowly. She was not safe yet. But there was someone who knew the truth and was standing in front of it, and that was more than she had had in Missouri at 17, and it was more than she had had at any point in the 14 months since she arrived in Harlan's Crossing. The weight of that fact pressed against her chest in a way that had nothing to do with fear. She walked home with her spine straight and her chin up, and let the people who watched her from their windows watch all they wanted. In the days that followed, the town of Harlan's Crossing underwent the particular transformation that happens when a community realizes it may have been wrong about something. It was not a clean or comfortable transformation. It moved in fits and starts, 2 steps of reconsideration followed by 1 step of digging back in. And throughout it, Fannie continued to teach school and Margaret Holt continued to decline slowly in the back bedroom of the house they shared. And Abel Keating continued to do what he had apparently been doing quietly for 3 days already, which was methodically dismantling the structure of the accusations against her. He came to the school on Wednesday afternoon, just as she was releasing the children for the day, and he waited until they had all scattered before he came inside. She was erasing the arithmetic lesson from the large chalkboard at the front of the room. She heard him come in and did not stop erasing. "I spoke with Rourke," he said. She turned around. There was chalk dust on her dark dress, white smudges at her waist where she had pressed the eraser. "And he denied knowing anyone named Morrow. He denied any interest in you or in Missouri property. He was very smooth about it." Abel stood with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim, and she had learned enough about him to know that this was as close as he came to visible agitation. "But I found the letter." She went very still. "What letter?" "He made the mistake of posting a letter while he was in town," Abel said. "The postmaster is a man named Ed Finch who is discreet when I ask him to be. The letter was addressed to Declan Morrow in Kansas City, and it contained a progress report of sorts." His voice remained level, but his hands had stopped turning the hat. "He mentioned you by name. He mentioned the Dawson fire. And he mentioned that, quote, 'The woman has the sheriff turned against her and only needs one more push before the community will do the rest.'" Fannie sat down on one of the children's benches. It was too small for her and she looked, she thought, probably ridiculous sitting on it, but her legs had made a decision. "They thought you'd stay out of it," she said. "They thought I'd either stay out of it or join it," he said. "They had been watching the town's attitude toward you for a while, I think, and they determined it was hostile enough to do their work for them." He set his hat down on the nearest desk, an unusual thing for him to do, and she understood it as a signal that something he was about to say required both hands free, metaphorically speaking. "Fannie, there's something else." She waited. The letter mentioned that if the community pressure wasn't sufficient, there was another option. He used the words more direct persuasion. Abel's eyes were very serious. "I don't know exactly what that means, but I'm not inclined to wait and find out." "You're going to arrest him," she said. "I'm going to arrest him," he agreed. "But I need more than the letter, which was unsealed and which he could argue was a private matter. I've written to the county marshal's office in Santa Fe, and I've also written directly to the lawyer in Missouri to establish your claim. Both letters went out today. But that will take time, and in the meantime I'm watching Rourke, and I need you to go about your life as normally as possible, because if he feels cornered, he may do something that is more useful to us than a progress report letter." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light was coming through the schoolhouse windows at an angle that made the chalk dust in the air look like something suspended, something held. "You have done an extraordinary amount of work on my behalf," she said. He said nothing. "Without being asked," she said, still nothing. "Abel." She said his name the way she had in his office without the careful formality. "Why?" He picked his hat back up. He turned it once by the brim. And then he said, with the same direct plainness he applied to everything, "Because it is the right thing to do, and because I am not willing to watch this town destroy someone he started again. Someone I believe to be a good person and an innocent one." The pause before the correction was small. She heard it as clearly as a bell. He put his hat on and said he would check in tomorrow and left. And Fannie sat on the too small bench for a while longer and let herself feel, very carefully, the full weight of what was happening to her, which was that she was falling in love with the sheriff of Harlan's Crossing in the middle of the most dangerous spring of her adult life, and that the two facts were somehow inseparable from each other. Caleb Rourke made his move on a Thursday evening, 6 days after the confrontation in the street. He did not make it against Fannie. He made it against Margaret Holt. Fannie came home from the schoolhouse at 4:30 to find Margaret in considerable distress in the parlor, a bruise forming on her right wrist where someone had grabbed it, and the small cash box that Margaret kept in the kitchen drawer sitting empty on the parlor table. Margaret was 70 years old and had only one good wrist, and she was shaking but not crying, which Fannie thought was one of the bravest things she had ever seen. "A man came," Margaret said. "He said he was from the county assessor's office, and I let him in because I know Ed Finch, who is the county assessor, and I thought it was legitimate." "He wasn't from the county assessor's office. What did he take?" Fannie asked, holding Margaret's uninjured hand and keeping her voice steady through an act of considerable will. "The cash, $62. Margaret's chin was firm. "And he went through the desk. I tried to stop him from the desk, and that is when he took hold of my wrist." She paused. "He was looking for something, I don't know what." Fannie knew what. She ran to her room and pulled the trunk out from under the bed and unlocked it and went through the papers in the bottom compartment. The bundle was still there, tied with brown string, the letters and documents her mother had pressed into her hands before she died, and that Fannie had carried for 8 years without ever fully reading, because opening them felt like something she had to be ready for and had never quite been. She brought the bundle back to the parlor and sat with Margaret and untied the string. There were 7 letters. 3 from her father's lawyer, whose name was a man named George Hatfield in Jefferson City, Missouri, each progressively more urgent in tone about the importance of contacting him regarding her father's estate. 2 personal letters from her father written in the year before his death, discussing his business and his plans, including a reference to a land purchase in central Missouri that he described as "the thing that will secure your future, Fannie, when I am gone, if the vultures do not get to it first." And 2 documents, official and stamped, that appeared to be a deed and a trust document, her name clearly written as beneficiary. Fannie sat on the parlor floor with Margaret beside her in her chair and read everything for the first time in 8 years, and felt the full dimensions of what Declan Morrow had been trying to take from her. She ran to the sheriff's office. She did not walk. She ran. Abel was at his desk when she came through the door, and he was on his feet before she had finished closing it behind her, moving around the desk toward her with a swiftness that had nothing official about it. "Margaret," he said immediately. "She's all right," Fannie said, catching her breath. "Rourke came to the house. He took $60 and he frightened her, but she's not badly hurt." She held up the bundle of papers. "He was looking for these. I had them hidden in my trunk. He didn't get them." Abel took the papers from her hands and went through them quickly and efficiently, and as he read the deed and the trust document, something in his expression sharpened into something she could only describe as satisfied fury. "This is exactly what I needed," he said. "This establishes your claim legally and unambiguously." Combined with the letter Rourke posted tomorrow, he stopped and looked at her. "Are you all right?" She had been asking herself the same question and coming up with the same uncertain answer. "I am angry," she said. He put his hands on a 70-year-old woman. "Yes," Abel said, and his voice was very quiet. "He did." He set the papers on his desk and picked up his hat and checked the pistol at his hip with a practiced hand. "I need you to go back to Margaret and stay there and lock the door. Ed Finch, the postmaster, is 2 doors down and he knows to watch for trouble. I'm going to find Rourke." Abel, he looked at her. There was something in his face that was not the careful, controlled expression she was accustomed to. It was rawer than that. It was personal. "I won't be long," he said. And then, without apparent planning, "I made a promise to myself when I became sheriff of this town that I would not let a guilty man walk, because it was easier than stopping him. And I made a different kind of promise more recently that I would not let a person he stopped again, in exactly the same place as the time before. Please lock the door," he said. She wanted to grab his arm and demand that he finish the sentence. She wanted to ask him what kind of promise, what kind of recently, what kind of person he was trying to say she was to him. Instead she said, "Be careful," and meant it in a way she had not meant anything in a long time, and left. He found Caleb Rourke at the Overland Hotel bar, exactly where Fannie would have predicted a man of that type to be, nursing a whiskey and looking self-satisfied. The arrest was, by Abel's later account to Fannie, uneventful in the physical sense. Rourke did not try to run, which Abel had half expected. He simply sat at the bar with a cold expression and said that Abel had no legal authority to arrest him, and that he would have the county marshal involved before morning. Abel had said calmly that he was welcome to contact the county marshal, who would find a telegram waiting for him from Abel's office outlining the situation, and that in the meantime Rourke would be spending the night in the Harlan's Crossing jail, and that if he was as certain of his legal standing as he claimed, the morning would resolve everything and he had nothing to worry about. Rourke was significantly less smooth in the cell, from what Ed Finch reported secondhand to anyone who would listen, which by Friday morning was most of the town. Something else happened on Friday morning, which was that the county marshal's office responded to Abel's telegram with one of their own, confirming that Declan Morrow was a known figure in the Missouri legal system, with a history of what the telegram called land manipulation and fraudulent claim schemes, and that the Missouri authorities had been looking for an opportunity to build a case against him that was solid enough to pursue. Abel came to the schoolhouse at the noon recess with this information, and Fannie stood in the schoolyard in the April sun and read the telegram twice and felt 8 years of carefully maintained watchfulness begin, very slowly, to unclench from somewhere behind her sternum. "It's not over," Abel said, standing beside her. "Morrow is still in Kansas City, and he will need to be dealt with through proper legal channels, which will take time. But Rourke will be transferred to Santa Fe and charged there, and the county marshal is engaging the Missouri authorities about Morrow directly. George Hatfield, your father's lawyer, has been contacted, and he is ready to formally file your claim." She looked up from the telegram. The children were running and shouting in the yard behind her, and the sky was very blue, and a hawk was doing something geometrically perfect over the ridge to the east. "How do you do that?" she asked. He looked at her steadily. "Do what?" "Sound so calm about all of it," she said, "as if you are simply moving pieces in a game that you have already decided to win." A small thing happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile, but it was the raw material of one. "I have decided to win," he said. "On my behalf," she said. "On behalf of what is right," he said carefully. "Abel." She turned to face him fully, the telegram still in her hand. The children were still running and shouting and not paying any attention to the adults by the schoolhouse door. I have been trying to be very appropriate about this, about you, about whatever it is that is happening." She paused. "But I find that I am running out of patience for being appropriate." He was very still. "You have done something for me that no one has done since my father," she said. "You stood up in the middle of that street and denied a lie that the whole town wanted to believe. And you did it before you had any legal obligation to. And you have spent the past week dismantling the architecture of a scheme that has been following me across 8 years and 2,000 miles." She stopped. "Tell me why, please. Finish the sentence." The hawk had stopped circling and disappeared somewhere behind the ridge. One of the children shouted something triumphant from the yard. Abel Keating stood in the April noon sunlight and looked at Fannie Ellsworth with the expression of a man who has been very careful for a long time and has found the edges of careful and can see past them. "Because," he said, "you are the most remarkable person I have ever met. And I have been watching you manage this town's hostility with more grace than it deserves for 14 months. And the idea that someone from your past constructed a trap specifically for you, using this town as a weapon." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "I was not going to let that stand. I was not going to watch this community drive you out the way Missouri apparently did. And the reason I was not going to let it stand is that you matter to me, considerably, in a way that has nothing to do with the star on my shirt." Fannie breathed. The sun was warm. The children were still running. "I see," she said. "I recognize this may be an inopportune moment," he said, with the particular awkwardness of a very controlled man experiencing feelings. "Given the current legal circumstances and the fact that you have 32 children expecting you in approximately 6 minutes. It is somewhat inopportune," she agreed. "But I wanted you to know." "Thank you," she said, "for the information and for the other things." They stood for a moment in the warm light, 4 feet apart, two people who had been carefully maintaining a distance that they had both apparently been finding increasingly arbitrary. "Would you have supper with me?" he asked. "This evening?" When the legal circumstances are temporarily at rest. She felt the thing in her chest that she had felt in the street that first morning, standing beside him in front of the crowd, that nameless, warm, and frightening shift. She let herself name it now. "Yes," she said, "I would." She went back to her 32 children. He went back to his office. And the April afternoon went about its business around them, the hawk circling back over the ridge, the children's voices fading as they filed back into the schoolhouse, the town of Harlan's Crossing going about its ordinary, extraordinary life. The supper was at the hotel dining room because it was the only establishment in Harlan's Crossing that served food of any particular quality, and because Fannie did not have the kitchen resources at present to cook a meal that felt appropriate to the occasion, and because Abel could not cook well enough to make the alternative viable. He wore his best shirt, which was a deep blue that did something specific to his eyes that she noticed, and then had to deliberately not comment on immediately. She wore a dress she had bought in Santa Fe and rarely had occasion to wear, a dark green that was perhaps slightly formal for Harlan's Crossing on a Friday, but that made her feel like herself in the best possible way. The hotel dining room fell quiet when they walked in together, and then unquieted, and the conversation that resumed was slightly different in quality from the conversation that had been happening a moment before, which was just the nature of small towns and was not, tonight, particularly threatening. They sat across from each other at a corner table and ate roast chicken and bread and drank coffee, and they talked for 3 hours. They talked about books, as they sometimes had before, but differently now, without the careful conversational buffer of formality. He told her he had read everything he could find about law and history, and that he found geography unexpectedly fascinating, maps particularly. The way a map contained the story of how people had moved across the earth and what they had been looking for. She told him about teaching, about the specific pleasure of watching a concept land in a child's mind, the moment when the abstract became concrete and the child's face changed. They talked about Missouri and Texas, about the particular shape of grief when you lost your parents young, and had to construct your adult self without a foundation. He had lost his mother at 20 and his father at 24, and those losses had, he said, given him a very clear sense of what actually mattered and what did not, which had made him both a better sheriff and a more solitary person than he might otherwise have been. "You are not so solitary as all that," she said. He looked at her across the table. "No," he said, "not always." They walked home by a long route that went past the church, and then down along the creek that ran south of town before looping back, toward the house she shared with Margaret. And the long April evening had given them a deep purple dusk that was not quite dark and not quite light, and was enormously useful for the slow movement toward each other that had been happening, in one way or another, for 14 months. At the gate of the house, she stopped and turned to face him, and he stopped too, and for a moment they stood in the dusk that was soft around the edges and full of the sound of the creek, and of some night bird he could probably name and she couldn't. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "If that is acceptable." "It is acceptable," she said, and then, because she had decided to be done with appropriate, "though I find that I would also accept improperly if the alternative is simply waiting longer than necessary." The corner of his mouth moved in that way that was the raw material of a smile, and then became the actual thing, and the smile transformed his face in a way that she filed away immediately and permanently, because she intended to see it as frequently as possible for as long as possible. He kissed her at the gate, briefly and warmly, with one hand at her jaw that was careful in a way that made her feel as if she was something worth being careful with. She kissed him back in the April dusk and felt 14 months of careful distance dissolve into something much simpler and much better. "Good night, Fannie," he said. "Good night, Abel," she said. She went inside and sat with Margaret, who was doing better and had made tea and who looked at Fanny's expression with the calm satisfaction of a woman who had been expecting something for a while and was glad to see it arrive. "Good evening," Margaret asked. "Very," Fanny said. The following weeks were a complicated braid of the legal and the personal, and they unwound together in the particular way of things that are deeply entangled. The legal first. Caleb Rourke was transferred to Santa Fe in mid-April, escorted by the county marshal's deputy, and the case against him was formally opened. George Hatfield, her father's lawyer in Missouri, proved to be a thorough and determined man, who had been fighting to preserve Fanny's claim against Morrow's interference for 3 years, and who treated the news of her survival and location and legal documentation with the kind of grim satisfaction that only a very tired man who is finally getting somewhere can manage. He wrote her a long and detailed letter explaining the property, which was 160 acres of farmland in central Missouri, currently rented to a farming family, and which was generating modest but real income that had been in escrow pending resolution of the claim dispute. Declan Morrow, confronted by the combined pressure of Missouri authorities, the territorial marshal, and a newly energized lawyer with actual documentation of his target's existence and legal standing, made the decision that small predators often make when their prey turns out to have teeth. He abandoned his claim and was subsequently charged in Missouri with a related fraud involving a different piece of property entirely, which the authorities there had apparently been waiting to do for some time. The danger that had followed Fannie Ellsworth for 8 years and across 2,000 miles collapsed in the span of 3 weeks, not dramatically, not in a final confrontation, but in the way things really end, through paperwork and legal processes and the slow grinding of official mechanisms, until the machinery of the scheme had nothing left to power it. Abel told her about Morrow's withdrawal on a Saturday morning, coming to the schoolhouse again, and she had learned by then to expect him there and to be glad of it. She had been sorting through a box of new readers that had arrived from the territory's education office, stacking them in subject piles on the desk, and when he came in and told her the news, she set the last reader down very carefully and stood for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. "Over," she said. "For the most part. he said. "There will still be legal formalities about the property, but the threat is gone." She nodded slowly. And then she walked around the desk and crossed the room to where he was standing by the door. And she did something she had been thinking about doing since the Friday evening at the gate, which was to put her arms around him without preamble. He was briefly still with surprise, and then he was not still at all, his arms coming around her solidly, one hand at her back and one at her shoulder, and they stood like that in the dusty Saturday morning light of the schoolhouse while something large and frightening finally stopped being large and frightening. "Thank you," she said against his shoulder. "You don't need to thank me," he said, and his voice was a little rough. "I want to," she said. "I want to every time I think of you standing in that street. I want to every time I think of the letter about the hinge, which I kept, by the way, in my desk drawer." She felt him still again, the way he had stilled at the gate. And then he made a sound that was a laugh, short and warm, a sound she had not heard from him before and that she would have liked to hear frequently. "You kept the note," he said. "I kept the note," she confirmed. He kissed the top of her head, which was a very different kind of thing from the gate kiss, but not less meaningful for that. The summer that followed was, by the standards of New Mexico Territory in 1883, relatively uneventful, which is to say that there was a cattle dispute that Abel managed, a drought that worried everyone and then resolved itself, 2 incidents of theft, and 1 fire that was definitively an accident and was contained before it caused serious damage. For Fannie, it was the first summer in recent memory in which she did not feel the background pressure of being watched with suspicion, and the relief of that was so physical that she sometimes noticed it simply as a change in the way she breathed. Abel courted her properly, as he had proposed, which in practice meant that he came to the house on Sundays and sometimes on weekday evenings, and that they walked together and talked, and that the walks got slower and the talking got deeper, and that occasionally, in the evening light, they were simply quiet together in a way that felt like its own kind of conversation. He told her about his time in Texas, about coming up from nothing, about the years of working cattle before he found his way into law, about the particular loneliness of the frontier and the way he had made peace with it, by deciding that solitude was not the same thing as loneliness if you chose it. He told her about his sister Clara in Colorado, who was married to a miner and had 2 small boys and who Abel visited when he could, which was not often enough by his own admission. He told her he had thought more than once that he was simply the kind of person who would live alone, that the specific combination of what he was and where he was made the alternative seem impractical. "And now," she said. They were sitting on the low stone wall at the back of the house, the one that Margaret's late husband had built decades ago, and that looked out over a slope of desert scrub toward the distant mountains. The evening was warm and the sky was doing the particular thing it did over New Mexico, where the colors were too saturated to be plausible, oranges and purples that looked painted. "Now," he said, "I cannot explain what I was thinking." She laughed. She laughed more than she had in years that summer, and she noticed it and was grateful for it the way you are grateful for the return of something you had stopped expecting. He met Margaret properly, which is to say they had a number of conversations in Margaret's parlor that went well beyond politeness. Margaret was 70 years old and had been a schoolteacher and then a school administrator and had opinions on everything and no patience for pretense, and she regarded Abel with the scrutiny of a woman who had seen enough people to know one from another. By the 3rd such conversation, she had apparently decided he was acceptable, which she communicated to Fannie by saying, with characteristic economy, "That man is serious. I like serious." In July, a letter arrived from his sister Clara, who had apparently been told about Fannie because Abel had apparently told her, and the letter was warm and funny, and full of questions that Clara had clearly been saving up. And Fannie wrote back a letter of equivalent warmth that took 2 drafts and a great deal of second-guessing, and that Clara responded to within 3 weeks with something that felt a great deal like enthusiasm. In August, Abel asked her to marry him. He did it in the evening at the back of the house, on the stone wall, which had become their particular place, without either of them having declared it so. He had, he admitted, thought about doing it somewhere more formal, but he had decided that formality was not what either of them actually needed from each other, and that honesty was, and that the most honest version of the question was this. Sitting on a wall in the New Mexico evening, with the desert going golden around them, the two of them side by side as they had been in the street in April, facing whatever it was together. He said, "Fannie, I would like to spend the rest of my life being a person you can count on. And I would like it if you wanted to spend the rest of your life being a person I can count on. And I recognize that you have managed your own life very capably for a long time and that you do not need me to manage it for you, and that what I am offering is partnership, not rescue, because you rescued yourself. I just stood in the street." She felt the tears come up before she expected them, which was embarrassing and also not at all, because it was precisely the right thing and he was precisely the right person, and this was precisely the right wall. "You did more than stand in the street," she said. "Not really," he said. "Abel," she said. "Fannie," he said. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes. For some time now, obviously yes." He put his arms around her, and she put hers around him, and they sat on the stone wall in the August evening, with the mountains going dark against the last of the light, and the thing that had been shifting and moving in her chest since the morning in April had settled, finally, into something she recognized as the simple weight of being exactly where she was supposed to be. They were married in October, by the minister at the small church, on a Saturday morning with a clear blue sky and the temperature precisely right, and the entire town of Harlan's crossing in attendance, including Orville Pratt, who shook Abel's hand afterward with the expression of a man who has learned something important and found it humbling. Margaret Holt sat in the front pew in her best dress and cried without embarrassment. The children from the school were in the third and fourth rows and had been instructed by their teacher, before she was no longer their teacher but their teacher's wife, to behave themselves, which they did with variable success. Clara came from Colorado with her husband Thomas and their 2 boys, and she hugged Fannie the way you hug a person you have already decided you love before you have met them, which was exactly how Fannie felt in return. The reception was held in the church hall with food provided by half the town, because that was what the town did, and it was, Fannie thought, one of the best things about small communities, the way they organized around occasions. Even the people who had watched her most suspiciously in the street in April had brought dishes, and she chose to understand that as a form of apology and to accept it as such, because the alternative was to carry a grudge into a marriage, and that seemed like a poor use of a good marriage. Abel danced exactly once, which was with his new wife, and he was not a skilled dancer, but he was a willing one, and he held her securely and looked at her with that expression she had catalogued and intended to see regularly for the rest of her life. The expression that was not the careful professional one but the rawer one, the personal one, the one that said he had built his walls very high, and she was the only person he had ever considered letting over them. She thought, dancing with him in the church hall with the October light coming through the windows and the fiddle playing something cheerful, that she had arrived in Harlan's Crossing on a cold February morning looking for a temporary teaching position, and had found instead the thing she had not known she was missing, which was not safety exactly, but the specific kind of safety that comes from being known fully by another person and not being lesser for it. They moved into the house across from the sheriff's office that Abel had lived in alone for 4 years, a house that was comfortable and slightly sparse in the way of bachelor dwellings, but that had good bones and a large window in the front room and a back porch that looked out toward the mountains. Fannie began teaching again in January, the new term, having negotiated with the town council that the schoolteacher's position was separate from the question of her marital status, because it was 1883, and that particular battle was apparently still necessary to fight, but she was accustomed to fighting it, and this time she had the sheriff's explicit support and Orville Pratt's implicit exhaustion with controversy. Margaret Holt passed away in December, peacefully, in the back bedroom of the house on the east edge of town, with Fannie beside her. She left the house and its contents to Fannie, which surprised no one who had known Margaret, and Fannie arranged for the house to be kept in good repair and eventually rented to the new teacher the town brought in to help her with the growing student population. Winter in Harlan's Crossing was cold and quiet, and Fannie and Abel were very good at being inside together, which is a thing you cannot know about a person until you are in fact inside with them, and it is very relevant. They read in the evenings, him at the desk with his legal papers and correspondence and occasionally his books, her at the table with her students' work and occasionally her own books, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they were quiet, and both were equally comfortable. He asked her about Missouri sometimes, not the dark parts but the early parts, what it had been like before the losses, and she told him about her father's farm and her mother's cooking, and the Missouri winter, which was wet and gray in a way entirely different from the New Mexico winter. And he listened in the way he listened to everything, completely and without interruption, as if what she said was the most important thing currently happening. In the spring of 1884, the territorial government formalized the legal resolution of her father's estate, and George Hatfield in Missouri wrote to inform her that the property was hers clear and uncontested, and that the rental income had been accumulating and was now a meaningful sum that she could direct as she chose. She wrote back to direct him to continue managing it and to deposit the income to the account she maintained in Santa Fe, because the resolution of the hidden motive that had driven her east across a continent was ultimately not about money, but it was also not about money, and knowing it was there, secure and hers, was the closing of a door she had not realized was still open. She told Abel that evening, and he read the lawyer's letter and set it down on the table and said, "Good," in the way he said things that mattered simply and without elaboration. "Good," she agreed. And then, because she had something else to tell him, something that she had known for 3 weeks and had been waiting for the right moment to say, she said, "Abel, I have some additional news." He looked at her. His attention was complete, the way it always was. "We are going to have a child," she said. The expression on his face was not one she had seen before, and she had thought she had catalogued the full range of them. It was open in a way that the others were not, wide open, all the careful walls down for a moment, and she watched him process it in real time, the information moving across his features the way weather moves across a clear sky. He stood up from the table and crossed to where she was sitting and crouched beside her chair and took both her hands in his, which was the most physically demonstrative thing she had seen him do spontaneously, and looked up at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said. "I feel completely normal except somewhat tired in the afternoon, which is apparently expected." He held her hands carefully, as if being careful with them was something he needed to do with his whole body right now. "A child," he said. "A child," she confirmed. He pressed his mouth to her hands, first one and then the other, and she felt the warmth of it run up her arms and into her chest and spread out from there. "I am very," he started and stopped and started again. "I don't have the word for what I am." "Happy," she offered. "That is not large enough," he said. She reached her free hand to his jaw, the way he had held hers the first time he kissed her, careful and deliberate. "Fortunately," she said, "I have enough words for both of us." He laughed the short, warm laugh she had been storing up since the schoolhouse in spring, and she felt it as much as heard it, and she thought that this was what it looked like to arrive somewhere. Their son was born in November of 1884, on a Sunday, which struck Fannie as fitting in some way she couldn't entirely articulate but felt deeply. He was a solid, loud, determined child who announced his opinions immediately, and did not seem inclined to moderate them, which Abel noted with the expression of a man who recognizes a characteristic but cannot decide if he is responsible for it. They named him James, after Fanny's father, which is what she had always intended to name a son, and which Abel said was right without any discussion required. James Edgar Keating was the subject of enormous interest from the town, because the town had the particular investment in the sheriff's children that small communities always develop, and because there were people who had watched the history of Fanny and Abel and felt themselves to have been part of it in some way. Participants in the drama of the spring of 1883 who were now being offered a resolution in the form of a healthy 11-pound infant with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray-green eyes. Clara came from Colorado for the birth, arriving 3 days before and staying 3 weeks after, and she and Fanny established a friendship in those 3 weeks that was the kind of friendship that does not require much time to become permanent. The two boys ran wild in the backyard and had to be supervised with the diligence appropriate to small children in close proximity to desert hazards, and Thomas, Clara's husband, played chess with Abel in the evenings with a seriousness that Fanny found both funny and touching. Abel held his son with the same careful precision he brought to everything he valued, and which, in this context, looked like something different from precision. He held James for long periods in the evenings when the child was first home, standing by the front window with the baby against his chest, and the street of Harlan's crossing going dark outside, and Fanny watched him from the doorway sometimes, and felt the enormity of gratitude not as an abstract but as something specific. This specific man, this specific child. This specific dark street outside this specific window in this specific town that had once stood in a crowd against her, and then been persuaded otherwise by the one voice that counted. James was a demanding infant, and then a demanding toddler, curious and vocal, and deeply interested in the mechanics of everything he encountered. He made his first recognizable speech at 14 months, which was the word "star," pointing at the badge on his father's shirt, and Abel's expression upon hearing it was one that Fanny pressed into her memory next to all the others, the full collection of a man's face opening. In 1886, the year James turned 2, 2 things happened that were notable and distinct. The first was that Orville Pratt, of all people, came to the house one afternoon and sat stiffly in the front room, and after a long silence said to Fanny that he owed her an apology, that he had allowed himself to be manipulated by Caleb Rourke's insinuations in the weeks before the confrontation in the street, because he had already been inclined to mistrust her, and that was his failing rather than hers, and that he was sorry for the distress he had caused. It was not a graceful apology, but it was a real one, and Fanny received it as such, and they reached the kind of understanding that allows a community to go forward without either forgetting what happened or being governed by it. The second notable thing was that James, at age 2, began a campaign to be given a puppy that was so sustained and articulate that Abel eventually said, with a straight face, that the boy had a legal career ahead of him, and acquired a shepherd dog puppy from a rancher north of town that James named directly and immediately upon meeting it, with the certainty of a person who has thought about this already. Deputy. Deputy the dog became a fixture of the Keating household and of the main street of Harlan's Crossing, where he accompanied Abel on his morning walk to the office with a gravity that charmed the town, and that James monitored closely from the front porch, as long as his legs could stand the waiting. Fanny continued teaching through 1886 and into 1887, managing the school with a second teacher now, a young woman named Ruth who had come from Albuquerque, and whom Fanny was mentoring with the specific attention she gave to people who had talent that needed someone to tell them it was real. She thought of Thomas, the mathematically gifted child from her early years at the school, who had by 1887 been sent by his father to study in Santa Fe after all, because some things resolve themselves slowly, but they do resolve. In 1887, Fanny discovered she was pregnant again and told Abel on a Sunday evening on the back porch, the same porch where the stone wall was that had been their particular place, and he responded in a way that was similar to the first time but had the additional dimension of a man who already knows what it means and is arriving at the joy from a different angle, one that accounts for what he already has. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He put his arm around her on the porch, and they looked at the mountains and the desert going gold in the evening light, and the dog who was asleep on the step with his head on his paws, and the small, dark-haired boy who had fallen asleep inside on the sofa holding a picture book about horses. "I thought I would be alone," Abel said, not with sadness, with a kind of wondering. "So did I," she said. They sat with that for a while, the fact of what had not happened, the lives they had not lived because of a morning in April of 1883 when a rumor had spread through a town, and a man had walked out of an office and stood beside her in the street. Their daughter was born in January of 1888, during a cold snap that had ice on the inside of the windows and the fire in the bedroom stove burning high all night. She was smaller than James had been and quieter from the first breath, watchful in a way that already seemed characteristic, looking at the world from the first day as if she was cataloging it for later use. They named her Clara, after Abel's sister, who cried when she got the letter and wrote back 6 pages that ended with an account of her reading the news to her husband and her husband saying, "Good, that's a good thing," and going back to his newspaper, which Clara said was the most enthusiastic response she had ever gotten out of him about anything and should be understood accordingly. Clara Keating grew into the watchful, intelligent child her first hours had suggested, with her mother's gray-green eyes and her father's tendency toward stillness. And she and James developed the specific sibling relationship of 2 strong personalities who genuinely like each other but fight about absolutely everything, which Fannie managed with the professional patience of a woman who had spent years teaching 30 children at once and found 2 comparatively manageable. The school in Harlan's Crossing grew because the town grew, because New Mexico Territory was growing in the late 1880s as the railroad came further into the territory, and people followed it looking for the particular future that the American West had always seemed to offer. Abel's role as sheriff grew with it, became more complex, involved more coordination with territorial authorities, and more management of the inevitable friction that came with population growth and the collision of old settlers with new arrivals. He handled it with the same even-handed stubbornness he brought to everything, and his reputation in the territory was such that he was asked in 1889 whether he would be willing to stand for a county judgeship when New Mexico eventually became a state. He told Fannie about it on the back porch, which was where they told each other the important things. "What do you want?" she asked. "I want to know what you think," he said. She considered it. "I think you have been a good sheriff," she said. "And I think you would be a good judge. I think the law was always the thing for you, not just the enforcement of it but the structure of it, and a judgeship is closer to the structure." She paused. "I think it would require changes. We might need to move to the county seat eventually." "I know," he said. "Would you mind leaving Harlan's Crossing?" she asked, and she meant it as an honest question because the town was bound up for him as much as for her in what had happened in the morning in the street and the 14 months before it. He thought about it seriously, which was why she trusted his answers. "I would miss it," he said, "but I would not grieve it. The things that matter to me are not the town. They are portable." She took his hand on the back porch in the evening. "All right," she said. "Then when the time comes, we go." The time came in 1890, when New Mexico Territory was pressing hard toward statehood, and the county's administrative structure was reorganizing to prepare for it. Abel was appointed to a county judgeship by the territorial governor's office, a formal appointment with a salary and a courthouse, and considerably more paperwork than law enforcement, but the same underlying commitment to the principle that justice was something that could be reached for, even if you never fully arrived. They moved to the county seat, a larger town called Beaumont, in the spring of 1890, with James, who was 5, and Clara, who was 2, and Deputy the dog, who was old now and gray around the muzzle, but still capable of the daily walk. They took a house on a quiet street with a backyard and a porch that faced east, and Fannie found the local school and assessed its needs with the eye of a woman who had been doing this for years, and who immediately identified 3 things that needed fixing and began fixing them. It was different from Harlan's crossing in the ways that more people and more formal institutions make things different, but it was also the same in the ways that mattered, which was that it was a community of people trying to make their lives work in the particular hard and beautiful land that was New Mexico. And Fannie was good at communities now in a way she had not been before, because she had been shown what it looked like when someone stood up for you in the middle of one. She thought about that sometimes. She thought about Orville Pratt and the 50 people in the street and the particular helplessness of that moment, the sound of the crowd, the feeling of going under. And then she thought about the door of the sheriff's office opening and the sound of boots on the boardwalk planks, deliberate and unhurried, and the man who came and stood beside her without hesitation, not behind, not in front, beside. She thought about what it had cost him, that moment. It had cost him nothing legally because he was right and he knew it and he had the evidence to prove it. But it had cost him something personally, because he had said, "I was with her," to a town that would make meaning from those words. And he had said it anyway, without apparent concern for what meaning they made, because the alternative was to let a lie stand. She had asked him once, much later, whether he had thought about the consequences of saying it. He had said, "I thought about the consequences of not saying it." She had wanted to write that down somewhere and keep it the way she had kept the note about the hinge. And in a sense she had, because she had told the story to her children when they were old enough to hear it, the story of the town and the rumor and the man who walked out of his office and said, "No, this is not true," and stood in the middle of the street until the truth had room to breathe. James Keating heard the story at 7 and decided his father was the greatest man alive, which Abel received with characteristic understatement, and which Fannie suspected he thought about when no one was watching. Clara Keating heard the story at 5 and asked 3 precise questions. Who started the rumor? Why did the town believe it so easily? And what happened to the man who came to take what was not his? Fannie answered all 3 with equal honesty, and Clara listened and then nodded and went back to the picture she was drawing. And Fannie thought that the child was going to be either a lawyer or a judge or someone who was neither of those things but equally formidable, and was glad of it. In the summer of 1891, with New Mexico still working toward statehood and Abel settling into the judgeship and Fannie managing the school in Beaumont, and the 2 children growing at the relentless pace of children who have decided they are in a hurry, Clara, the dog-naming elder, sent a letter to say that she and Thomas were coming to visit, and that furthermore she wanted Fannie to know that she considered what had happened in Harlan's crossing in 1883, all of it, the rumor and the trial and the courtship and the marriage, to be the best thing that had ever happened to her brother, not because of the drama of it, but because of who it had brought him. Fannie read the letter at the kitchen table in the early morning, before the children were awake, and before Abel had come down from upstairs. And she sat with Clara's words, and the morning light coming through the east-facing window, and thought about that February morning in 1882, when she had stepped off a stagecoach in Harlan's crossing with a single large trunk and a teaching kit, and the accumulated weight of a life that had given her more difficulty than she deserved, and no particular reason to expect that to change. She heard him on the stairs, the particular sound of Abel's footsteps that she had memorized without intending to and that she would have known anywhere. And then he came into the kitchen in his shirt sleeves with his hair not yet ordered for the day, looking as he always did in the mornings, slightly less composed than the rest of the time and somehow more essentially himself for it. He saw her at the table with the letter and raised an eyebrow. "Clara." "She says you are the best thing that ever happened to her," Fannie said, "which I think she means the other way around." He smiled the full smile, not the corner of the mouth thing, the real one, the one she had first seen on an April afternoon in a schoolyard and that she had been keeping ever since. He came to the table and kissed her on the temple and poured himself coffee from the pot on the stove and sat across from her, and they sat in the morning kitchen while the house around them was quiet and the east light was clean and gold on everything. "Clara is coming to visit," she said. "Good," he said. He drank his coffee. He was reading the territorial newspaper with his free hand, and she was reading the letter again, and the dog was asleep under the table, and from upstairs came the sound of small feet hitting the floor with the confidence of people who have never once been quiet about getting out of bed. "Papa," James announced from the top of the stairs, "Clara pulled my hair." "Clara," Abel said without looking up from his paper. "He deserved it," said a small, precise voice from the hallway. "No one deserves having their hair pulled," Abel said. "Come down for breakfast." 2 pairs of feet hit the stairs. Fannie refilled her coffee and set Clara's letter aside and got up to start the breakfast things, and Abel put down his paper and came to help her because that was what they did, and the kitchen filled up with the noise of 2 children and a dog and a morning that was ordinary and extraordinary in equal measure. Outside, Beaumont was waking up. The storekeeper across the street was opening his shutters. The blacksmith's forge was beginning to smoke. A rider came down the main road headed east, stirring up the pale summer dust. New Mexico Territory went about its business under the wide blue sky, working toward a future that was still being decided, as futures always are, one ordinary morning at a time. Fannie stood at the stove stirring oatmeal and thought about all of it, the chain of things that had brought her to this kitchen, this morning, this noise, this life. The rumor that had spread through a town, the door that had opened, the man who had walked out of it. She thought about how easy it would have been for him to stay inside, to wait and see, to not intervene, to let the machinery of small-town judgment grind her down the way it had in Missouri, quietly and efficiently, and with the particular cruelty of things done by consensus, so that no one person has to take responsibility. He had not stayed inside. He had come out into the street and he had stood beside her and he had said, clearly and for everyone to hear, that the rumor was wrong, that he knew it was wrong, that he had been there, and he could tell them exactly where she had been and what she had been doing, and that the accusation was a lie. He had not been heroic about it in any theatrical sense. He had simply done it, the way he did most things, as if the right action was apparent and the only question was the execution. He had done it because it was true, and because she deserved the truth to be spoken, and because he was the kind of person who could not watch an injustice happen without putting himself between it and its target. And she had been the target, and he had been between, and from that position, from that single morning in a dusty New Mexico street with 50 hostile people watching, and the April sun coming over the eastern ridge, everything else had followed. A marriage. 2 children and their noise and their arguments about whether hair pulling is ever justified. A dog named Deputy who was now very gray and very slow but still got his morning walk. A back porch and a house in Beaumont and a county judgeship, and a letter from a sister who had decided she loved Fannie before she met her and had been proven right. 160 acres in Missouri that generated modest income and represented the thing her father had wanted for her. 8 years of fear that had dissolved in 3 weeks of paperwork. A life. A whole, complete, good life, made from a morning when someone had simply told the truth out loud. Fannie. Abel's voice from the table, where he was currently arbitrating a dispute about who sat where that had apparently become very urgent. "Oatmeal smells like it's ready." She laughed. She took the oatmeal off the stove and brought it to the table and sat down in the middle of all the noise and all the ordinary goodness of it, across from her husband and beside her children, and with the dog nosing hopefully at her ankle, and the summer light coming through the east window and the territorial newspaper folded on the chair beside Abel's coffee cup. "Thank you," she said, to no one in particular and to all of them. Abel looked at her from across the table with the expression that was the full one, the open one, the one with all the walls down. "For what?" he said. She reached across the table and took his hand briefly, because James was already reaching for the oatmeal spoon, and Clara was about to correct him on technique, and the dog had escalated his ankle campaign, and there was no time for anything lengthy. She took his hand and held it for a moment, and he held hers back, and that was enough, as it had been enough since the beginning, since the gate in April with the night bird and the creek sound and the dusk going soft around everything. That was enough. This was enough. All of it was enough and more than enough, and she was grateful and she was home.